Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our June CPCA webinar, co-sponsored with the American Coatings Association. I'm your moderator, Chris Weigel from Omnitech International and the CPCA chairman. We appreciate you spending your lunchtime with us and hope that everyone and their families are continuing to stay healthy and that your business is doing well.
Join the meeting.
We have a very full and exciting agenda for our webinar. However, I'd like to first introduce David Darling. David is Vice President of Health, Safety, and Environmental Affairs at American Coatings Association. David has been at the ACA for nearly 24 years. He works on various environmental issues, including VOCs and sustainability. At this time, I'd like to welcome him to say a few words.
Thanks, Chris. And Chris, thank you for allowing us to participate on the webinar today. I'm very happy that Doug Mazzefa and Sherwin-Williams is going to speak today about the critical need for preservatives and biocides. As more and more coatings are formulated to be water-based and low VOC, effective preservatives and biocides are needed to reduce the threat of spoilage. And I really look forward to Doug's presentation. And I want to once again thank Doug for all his work on the preservative life cycle assessment that was completed as part of the ACA Preservation Product Stewardship Working Group. Thank you.
Great, thanks to David and again, the American Coatings Association for collaborating with us on this webinar and your continued support of the CPCA. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Doug Mazzefa. He's the Global Sustainability Director for Sherwin-Williams Company. Doug is a leading expert in life cycle analysis, corporate sustainability, and green chemistry. His sustainability work was recognized by the coating industry when he was presented with the 2016 Industry Achievement Award from the American Coatings Association. He's also a very highly sought after speaker. He lectures at dozens of universities, as well as presenting at numerous national conferences, webinars, radio shows, and even television programs. Doug has been cited as a sustainability expert in dozens of major media outlets such as BBC, CNN, and USA Today. Doug acquired his master's degree in corporate environmental management at the Donald Bren School of Environmental Science and Management and his undergraduate work in environmental science and economics at Miami University. Doug also sits on numerous advisory committees, including those in the American Coatings Association, Society of Environmental Toxicity and Chemistry, and the U.S. Green Building Council. To top it off, he is a former All-American and national chess champion. We ask at this time that everyone put their mics on mute for the duration of the meeting, and we encourage you to type in any questions or comments in the chat box. We will answer your questions after Doug's presentation. And now at this time, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to Doug.
Thank you, Chris and Dave for the kind words and allowing me to present to you folks here today. So as mentioned, I'm Doug Mazzefa, Global Sustainability Director for Sherwin-Williams. And what I'm really going to walk through here is some work that was done via the American Coatings Association with a number of industry, both coatings industry and raw material companies, sort of the Dow Chemicals of the world, if you will, and biocide manufacturers, really to try to understand the impacts and benefits of biocides and how the coatings industry uses them, especially on the heels of a lot of regulations and pressures we're seeing specific to biocides, not just in the US, also Canada, Europe, and elsewhere. So, the way I kind of set this talk up is, I want to give sort of a little bit of a high-level background on life cycle assessment and sustainability, since that's sort of the lens we're looking at preservation through. And life cycle assessment was sort of the mechanism that we use to do the accounting for the article that we've published in Coatings Tech and elsewhere. So with that, I will just sort of jump into it. Just quick I'll spend like a minute on this. Just most folks are, I'm sure, familiar with Sherwin-Williams. We're the largest coating company in the world. Some metrics there. The one I just like to point out because it's maybe the most surprising to people is the 4,700 company-owned stores. Those aren't just stores that our products are sold in. Those are actually Sherwin-Williams stores. So, we're actually quite a big retailer in our own right, and, a very global company, albeit, sort of dominant in or primarily focused in kind of North America. Is our, you can see 80% of our sales. And, not just paints, also have a significant portion of our sales are sort of industrial coatings or things like food packaging, coil, for industrial equipment, marine, so on and so forth. So, a lot of, probably not in the industry so much, but a lot of customers, I think, just consider us sort of a paint company, but, certainly have sort of a lot more than that sort of in our portfolio. So getting more to the topic at hand. So the real background here to set the stage a little bit. So I've been with the industry about 8 or so years. I'm a sustainability practitioner, sort of by training, specifically life cycle assessment and corporate sustainability. When I joined the industry 8 or so years ago, there were certainly, folks were doing, taking actions around sustainability, whether it's on the chemistry side or carbon or whatever. But really, it was more of I would say, kind of a soft value proposition. Folks weren't sort of beating down the doors, asking for green products. It was sort of maybe more of a nice to have as opposed to sort of a table stakes sort of issue. What's really happened, especially in the past 2 or 3 years, is we have seen orders of magnitude growth in this area. I mean, no exaggeration. We've been tracking 400 to 800% increase in requests year over year for about the past 5 or so years. And so it may have started sort of modestly, but now we're really in a position where it's like, wow, this is becoming that table stakes sort of issue. And this has been driven by the early days. It was, I would say, primarily programs like the LEED Green Building Program, LEED being an acronym for Leadership of Energy and Environmental Design, powered by the US Green Building Council. There's other eco labels and programs out there, and certain agencies sort of gave some extra credit, if you will, for products with green attributes. But it was sort of more sort of upon request. Now we're seeing the more typical from do-it-yourselfer customers to brands like an IKEA or a Ball Corporation or investors have become one of the more vocal sets of folks. It's sort of, whereas sustainability, when I left grad school 15 or so years ago, it was still sort of perceived as a cost. To be more sustainable meant write a bigger check and go after these things that might not ultimately help your bottom line. That's really seems to be no longer true. It's it sort of went from that to a differentiator, and now it's sort of an expectation. And with that, we have seen, whether it's nonprofits or regulators or customers, whatever, really looking at biocides, calling them out specifically. And so, biocides, or you'll hear me say preservatives, not that we are major users of them, but as Dave sort of alluded to in his introduction, as we've moved from solvent-based chemistries to water-based chemistries, really biocides were a key part of allowing us to really reduce VOC content and emissions of our product. And it's a really nuanced area. I joke with our microbiology lab here that my life was a lot easier when I didn't really know anything about biocides, but there's not just one type. It's, there's for coatings, you'll usually have a wet state biocide when it's still like a liquid product, so cans aren't exploding on trucks. Some products will have a dry film preservative, especially exterior products, so you're not having mildew growing on them. You can also have quick kill biocides, where if you have a batch that you're making in a facility has some contamination, you can sort of dose it with some quick kill and basically bring the batch back into spec, so you don't have to basically throw away what could be a 50,000 gallon batch of coating. So, it's not one size fits all. And, they're prolific in our supply chain because, for the most part, we are not using sterile, pharmaceutical grade sorts of materials. We're not like a microprocessor facility with clean rooms. I mean, having been in dozens of paint facilities, not that they're dirty, but it's just these are products with a pH and makeup that are extremely susceptible to microbial attack. And so we really need, preservatives to ensure that they're not, going bad or spoiling before someone's able to use that product. So it is a very regulated space. It's FIFRA, which is a federal insecticide, fungicide, rodenticide, and algicide. But FIFRA is sort of the regulation that sort of powers biocides, and then there's treated articles, and I'm definitely not the person to talk about all the nuance of biocides. But the point here is that there's a lot of sort of buzzwords around biocides and preservatives, even in just coating products, and that they're sort of unnecessary. And we're really talking 99 times out of 100 about just making sure our products aren't spoiled. Although, to be transparent, there certainly are some products. Sherwin-Williams has Paint Shield, for example, where there's actually a kill claim associated with the product, but that product is registered via that FIFRA regulation. And EPA does a lot of work to sort of, it's not just like if you can fog a mirror, you can use this biocide wherever you want. They are actually saying you can use up to this amount of this preservative or biocide in paints and coatings, and so it's actually way more formal than I think folks realize. So, and one of the challenges too, because although we do get a lot of pressure from customers and other stakeholders, there seems to be some confusion maybe on the regulatory side as well. And to be fair, I don't want this I'm not going to sit here and attack or be overly negative, with regulatory frameworks. They're necessary. Public safety is a primary thing. Everybody, myself included, could, nothing's perfect. But I very much understand that these groups take a hazard-based approach, and there is I believe a very defensible reason for that, to look at if this material has a hazard associated with it, we're going to put XYZ parameters around it. Makes sense. But the challenge with biocides is when you look at them in a vacuum, for something to inhibit microbial growth or in some cases kill it to bring a batch back into spec, some of these, when you're just looking at the hazard, can kind of unfairly stack the deck a little bit against these things. And when there's no consideration of benefit, or the fact that we're using very, very small amounts, 1, 2, 3,000 parts per million, not to mention a lot of the biocidal products that our industry uses are very common in personal care products. For example, and I'll be careful here not to ever say any company names or product names, but one of the best-selling shampoos globally, not that I'm an expert on shampoo, that ship sailed with me quite some time ago, but there is a preservative, zinc-omidine or zinc pyrithione, that is I would say fairly common in exterior products, which needs some of that sort of preventing some algicide sort of a growth on an exterior humid sort of environment, that will use 0.1 or 0.2% of the product by weight of this material, but then it could be 1 or 2% of a shampoo, a very widely commercially available one. And our industry has faced challenges where we're losing the ability to use some of these things, but it's still fine to be sort of rubbing it on your body at much higher quantities. So we're really trying to showcase that we're using these things responsibly, and on the sustainability side, that these things actually have made our products more sustainable. And if we're not careful, if we don't think about what we call life cycle thinking, that if we make this change to one small part of the chemistry, what are the ripple effects of that? If it affects performance, now you need more product. If there's more spoilage, costs could go up, or folks can't touch up their product. You can't just, put the paint can lid back on and put it in your garage. As soon as you use it. You either have to refrigerate it or throw it away or whatever. There's a lot of other considerations. And so, what I will get to here is sort of, we basically quantified the environmental impacts and benefits of sort of our current state, and then some of what we've been seeing groups sort of pushing the industry to do, whether or not the technology even exists, and trying to quantify that. So, I just want to be clear, this is very much, we're sort of, as an industry, all facing this sort of challenge. This is not a company to company issue. And, that's why, very much appreciate Dave and ACA being, very supportive to bringing together, the industry with the Preservation Stewardship Committee that it was formed several years ago, and then, being supportive of this sort of research. So my kind of theme, I'll just hit ad nauseum, is that kind of life cycle thinking that, you can't just look at any single attribute in a vacuum, that without considering the what happens throughout the rest of the value chain. So the way we sort of go about this, and for the purposes of this publication, was by doing what's called a life cycle assessment, or LCA. And for those of you who aren't familiar with life cycle assessment, really it's the gold standard for environmental footprinting. If you've ever, carbon footprint, energy footprint, water footprint, if you've heard those terms before, those are just sort of a watered down sort of life cycle assessment. This is a holistic way of figuring out all of your impacts, sort of from cradle to grave. So, sort of the three main differentiators of life cycle assessment. The first one's that cradle to grave sort of perspective. So you're not just looking at, emissions while someone's painting. You're not just looking at packaging or transportation. You are considering raw material impacts, extracting and refining those raw materials, ilmenite ore into TiO2, for example. So raw materials, manufacturing, packaging, transportation, use, and disposal. So, really looking at the big picture, because if you just get, if you switch to a different raw material and you say, oh, wow, I shrunk my carbon footprint by 5% by going from raw material X to raw material Z, that could be accurate. But if it turns out that's now being shipped, 3,000 miles further, because you're getting it from Micronesia rather than, from a supplier in your backyard, without considering that transportation piece, you actually may have made your footprint worse. So LCA is really good about looking at what's called burden shifting, and to sort of help avoid sort of unintentional consequences of different actions. So the holistic life cycle, or cradle to grave, that's kind of key attribute number one. Number two is it looks at multiple environmental indicators. And so I've listed them sort of under that fourth bullet there. You can do, literally dozens and dozens of them. Generally, there's about 6 or so that, and you'll see, I think we did 5 or 6 for this publication. So carbon footprint, water, energy, acidification, smog, so on and so forth. So, and once again, the idea is that, if you get 5% better in, ozone depletion, but your carbon footprint just doubled, is that really getting better? So it's trying to avoid those, burden shifts, and just, you want to avoid, analysis paralysis. You don't want to go, you can go too crazy with these things, but you start to look for more of a well-rounded performer, or you do assessments to figure out, what your customers care about, what your industry impacts. Because, one thing about sustainability is, as I've learned really from day one in this field, is that, if I gave you my top 5 sustainability issues, what I think are the 5 most pressing things around sustainability, facing humanity, that list is not going to match other people's list. And, that's because there's not one right answer. It's a matter of perspective, of region, of industry, so, and that's okay. But, it's important to sort of keep that sort of gut check with it, that, you can't just simplify these things into one number, but you also can't get paralyzed by, some of the trade-offs that can occur in these sorts of things. So to recap there, number one key thing, cradle to grave. Number two one is you're looking at multiple indicators. The third thing, and maybe the most important for our industry's purposes, is that it actually considers functional performance when you do a cradle to grave assessment. So, this is a really nice thing because, so in LCA, to use the goofy terminology, it's called a functional unit. So there's functional unit and declared unit. The declared unit is when you're just looking at like a gallon of paint A to a gallon of paint B, or a kilogram of A versus a kilogram of B. The challenge with that is, the greenest gallon of paint, when you don't consider performance, would just be a bucket of water with a rock floating in it. You don't care about performance, so just, you have no incentive to make the product work at all. When you do a functional unit, which is what we did here, and generally what the industry does through the product category rules that ACA has sort of powered, is, actually write out, it's not a kilogram, it's how much of this coating does it take to cover a square meter of substrate for 60 years, or whatever the expected lifetime of the substrate is. And then, it gets further defined because, cover and protect, you need standards behind that, ASTM test methods about how do you do opacity, or how many scrubs is, good, or things like that. And that's where it goes beyond my comprehension of coatings. But, but it's a key thing, especially with conversations like this, because, when you're just looking at maybe hazard, then you don't really care about what happens to the overall product performance side of things. And that's where LCA can really sort of give you a more maybe realistic picture of what's going on. Now, I do want to be transparent, though, that LCA is far from perfect. I've been doing this for 15 years. I don't even know how many thousands of LCAs I've done in over 200 industries. It's the best methodology out there right now, but the data gaps are still present. I mean, I think it's improved greatly even in the past 5 years, but I would always advise a little bit of caution on the comparability side of things, or maybe a lot of caution. But this has been around since the 60s. EPA actually powers the mathematics behind LCA. It's called TRACI. It's an acronym. TRACI is we call it the method that we use in the U.S. So we're trying to basically use sort of an EPA powered tool and a methodology that's very widely accepted to sort of showcase like, hey, something's not right here. So, to drive this point home, and I won't belabor this, you're probably thinking, what the heck could this slide possibly convey? So this is something I like to do. I teach some courses at universities, and I love doing this in the classrooms. It's kind of funny to watch how people sort of come at it. But the idea here is you see a box. Inside the box are 3 rows of 3 dots. Dots are the same size, evenly spaced. And, the exercise, and hopefully you can see my mouse here, is, you would ask somebody to connect all 9 of these dots using 4 straight lines, but without lifting your pen or pencil or finger or whatever. And so if you connect the 4 corners, so like 1 line, 2, 3, 4, you miss the center dot. If you do a snake-wise fashion, 1, 2, 3, 4, you miss kind of the bottom right 2 dots. And so I usually give folks a few minutes, and the truth is, it's a bit of a cliche, and it's something that folks usually either get in 5 seconds, or they can sometimes spend hours. I've had students like not want me to tell them, and then go home for a weekend and come back like with like bloodshot eyes, and it's like, no, really, it's like a parlor trick sort of thing. It's the think outside the box sort of cliche. And I said the box was there. I never said you had to stay inside of it. So in fact, you can see you can actually do it with 3 straight lines, but if I say that, it sort of gives it away. So yeah, it's that really, really cliche think outside the box. But with LCA, it's a lot of lateral thinking. If I make this tweak, what are those ripple effects? Because the one thing I learned early on, with coatings formulators is, if I say, oh, the polymer is the biggest impact of this system, just use a different polymer. Oh, they love that. It's just so easy. Why did I think of that? Why just, I go from an epoxy to an acrylic. It's, these things are interchangeable. So maybe the polymer's the biggest impact, but maybe that's the only reason that it can perform so well. And so, there's a very good and viable reason sort of for that, or, the technology is not there yet, or whatever that may be. So, once again, it's just that keep that sort of lateral thinking, that sort of, what is the cause and effect and the ripple effects of whatever sort of things we tinker with in a life cycle assessment. So this slide just illustrates the different life cycle phases, as I mentioned, raw materials, acquisition, manufacturing, packaging, transportation, use, and disposal is a pretty reliable way to sort of think about where the impacts occur. Some of the standards in LCA, one thing I neglected to mention on an earlier slide is that there are a litany of international standards about how to do LCA, how to do LCA for public claims, how to do LCA for public claims for construction materials. And then, the industry also writes some rule sets on top of that. So, these are not just like, wave a magic wand and sort of regurgitate a number. There's actually a fairly well-defined process, but, not a perfect process, but a constantly evolving and fairly well battle-tested process to sort of go through, this exercise and disclose the results of these things. So to give an example, and this is maybe hard for folks to read, so what you're looking at here, and I want to be, as the bottom of the slide here points out, this is not a Sherwin-Williams slide. This is from a company called Cascades. I've been using the slide for about 10 years, but it's for food packaging. And so each column that you see is a different packaging type. So the first one's polystyrene foam, second one is oriented polystyrene, and so on and so forth. Each row is a different environmental indicator, or an LCA, we call it an impact category. So you have human health, ecosystems damage, climate change, resource depletion, aquatic acidification, and aquatic eutrophication. And then within each row, you will see one red dot normalized to 100%. So what they've done here is they normalized each row or each material for each indicator against the worst performing one in that indicator. So for the first one, human health, PET has the worst score, 100%, and molded pulp, which is on the far right, is 10%. So presumably, as long as they didn't weight things, the molded pulp impact was probably, 1/10 of what the PET human health toxicity impact was. And so they do that kind of all the way across the board. And, once again, in the classroom, I like to, sort of wax poetic and, bore people to tears with it. But, the kind of fun exercise here is like, okay, so, it seems like I give you a lot of information here. What's the best solution? And, what most people generally conclusion they come to is they'll say the first one, because if you average those numbers, I believe the first column has the lowest average impact. And so, the question is that right? And, with a lot of economics or sustainability sorts of things, is it right or wrong? Well, it depends. It depends what you care about. So, what's interesting though about this and why I like this graphic so much is, okay, so let's, even if I'm doing the math wrong, let's say, polystyrene foam has the lowest average impact if you average the numbers across. If we all agreed that the different indicators are roughly equivalent, which I don't think we'd ever do, because human health versus like aquatic eutrophication. I'm not saying eutrophication is not important. I don't think 95% of the people know what it is. It's basically a water pollution. It's algal blooms from usually pesticide runoff. But there's everyone's going to have a different sort of list in terms of which are the most critical. But even if we granted the premise and said, okay, they are all equal, I'm still not sure. I would say I'd pick the first column. And, that's because I haven't really given you enough information here, even from an environmental perspective. I could say, oh, well, you don't know about cost or customer satisfaction or availability or whatever. But, we're talking about food packaging. And I'm sure a lot of folks on this call have, seen some of the single-use plastics legislation that's coming out and some of the crackdown on plastic packaging in certain places. So I mentioned that first column's polystyrene foam. Waste is going to be an issue for that. You don't see waste as an indicator there. In fact, waste is something LCA tends to struggle with because it starts getting a little bit like, what is a waste? Is if I'm emitting water that's just as clean as when I took it because I'm just using it to heat something as steam. Is that a waste? It's a it's an effluent. It could be, so it's kind of gets arbitrary with it. But, I think we could all agree that, a polystyrene foam could present from a customer's perspective more of a waste issue in the fourth column, which is recycled PET. With all the push towards circularity and a circular economy, now you've got a recycled feedstock. But, once again, because in here is nothing around cost or performance, it's not necessarily that easy. And so it's, I do this more of a cautionary tale that you need to be careful with assumptions. And, I could definitely make a case for 4 of the packaging types in here, even with very limited information. There's also different uncertainties between these indicators, like climate change is a really tight sort of agreed upon calculation with very little change year to year. There's little modest characterization factor changes, but I mean, it's a pretty gosh dang stable calculation. Human health, you need 3 orders of magnitude difference in results before it's even statistically significant. So, even though you see a 100% red dot and a 10% green dot, those are without a doubt not, they could be different, but statistically speaking, that could be just due to random chance. So, there's also sort of not just how much you care about these things relative to each other or your customers or whatever, but, how much uncertainty exists in the calculation. Because, human health, no one's cracked that nut, and I'm sure they won't in my lifetime. But, some of these other ones, you can actually kind of in a laboratory setting, get very repeatable, reliable results, which, we can't necessarily do with a human person. So just sort of keep, some of this, in mind as we sort of go through. So now that I've bored you to tears with sort of what was the process we went through for this exercise, why does this matter for product preservation? So, the key thing here is life cycle assessment and the methods we used and the standards we used. It's that capturing that product performance piece of it. If you take away all the preservatives in a product, you're going to have some issues in terms of spoilage and rework and cans exploding and people, having stuff growing on their walls. So, we were able to take that information into account through different scenarios and kind of say, this is what happens, this is an expected spoilage rate, and this is data that came from the industry, and I want to be clear, like we were very cautious with the numbers we selected and published those numbers, and you'll see them here in a few slides, because we didn't want folks to think we're stacking the deck. It's sort of like we're kind of so confident in a lot of these sort of metrics that we sort of pull punches to make sure it's just like, we don't want folks to be able to poke holes in terms of, what the energy impacts were for refrigeration or pasteurization or something like that. And, but the key thing sort of building off of that product preservation or performance rather is, what a lot of companies and, Sherwin-Williams being one of them, it's a distinction between footprinting, carbon footprint, water footprint, energy footprint, and what's called hand printing. So footprinting, folks are probably fairly comfortable with this, even if you're not in a sustainability function or sort of interacting with those sorts of folks. It's, the goal is to hit 0. Footprinting, the bigger your footprint, the more damage is. So the idea is that you want to lower that number. That's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There is a reason why that was kind of the starting point. Hand printing, you start talking about and quantifying the benefit that your product or material provides. So, and I also want to be clear, this is not so you can report some negative number, which will not fly with the sniff test, and you might have the FTC knocking on your door, but it's just to kind of showcase that, coatings, for example, a lot of them are there to protect substrates that are much more impactful, sometimes 2, 3, 4 orders of magnitude more impactful than the thin film of coating on it. You get rid of the coating on a car, watch what happens with rusting or infrastructure, bridges, skyscrapers, coil, whatever, food packaging, aluminum cans. You don't coat these things, there are serious repercussions. So, we're not doing this once again to report negative, ridiculous numbers, but it's sort of a way for us to back into sort of the handprint of biocides, is significant. They are providing a major benefit that, we could not achieve without them. So, we leaned on LCA really to show the trade-offs. If you make this formulation change here, now you have to refrigerate trucks, or you have to, have people store it in a refrigerator or pasteurize or whatever. So being able to sort of do sort of a sensitivity analysis or these sort of assumptions to see what happens if you pull this lever. And one thing I will also be candid with is, biocides, as I said at the beginning, they're 0.1 to 0.3, 1,000 to 3,000 parts per million, thereabouts. I'm mostly speaking to latex paint. That number could be totally different for an anti-fouling coating or something else. But they're significantly less than 1% of a coating. If you look at their percentage of the impact of a kilogram of paint or whatever size quantity of paint, they're a few percent, 1 to 3% thereabouts, depends on the indicator. So I do think it'd be fair to say these things are synthesized in a sort of a reasonably resource intensive way, so there is a slightly disproportionate impact contribution for their how much they make up the formulation. But as you'll see here, you get rid of them or start messing with them in a suboptimal way, the impact, you start talking about 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, even more difference in what the impacts could be if we can't protect our products appropriately. And and you'll see those differences because it's product spoiling, it's rework, it's having to ship things back to facilities from distribution centers to touch them up, lower performance lifetimes because you've got stuff growing on them, and so on and so forth. And before I share sort of the results, just one thing that you've heard me sort of go back and forth between preservative and biocide in terms of terminology. When I'm speaking with non-industry folks, I typically would be saying, preservatives or preservation. From a purely sort of optics standpoint, it's I think been to folks sort of disadvantage with, the term, I think they're both technically accurate, but, biocide is sort of what you see in a lot of standards. It's almost become a bit of a dirty word. I mean, just break up the Latin root with, side in there. It's kind of, I believe, to kill. So, with preservation, I feel like for how our industry generally uses these things, it's not that active killing, with the exception of products registered with a FIFRA claim to make that health-based claim around killing a certain percent of a specific bacteria or virus or whatever. It's preservation. These are there to make sure our products aren't spoiling, and that's that's the kind of general rule of thumb. And in terms of the benefits, it's kind of the inverse of the slide before. It allows us to have moved away from a lot of solvents. It allows us to get better lifetimes, to allow folks to be able to touch up a year later after they open up the can of paint or whatever that may be. So the publication, I've sort of alluded to is through Coatings Tech magazine. The most recent issue I'll hold up here. So it's the Coatings Tech, I think May issue. May 2021 was the second version. You'll see also on the right there, August of 2018, we had also published a kind of a more streamlined version of this. So really this second iteration was building out a lot of the assumptions and other technologies and refining certain assumptions. But really it's a life cycle assessment of architectural coatings, and considering about 8 or so different scenarios around preservation and what it does to those products. And I realized about 20 minutes ago I put the wrong slide in here, so I apologize, and I can make sure I get folks this information or it is in the magazine. But so you'll see some acronyms there. I stupidly thought the text to the right was describing the acronym, but it is not. But just to quickly go through these, the general rule of thumb is WB is water-based. So anything with WB, it's a water-based chemistry. SB is solvent-based. But you have sort of a control, which was just a commercially available paint that people can buy today, sort of a typical, like a mid sort of performing product. The WBH is a high performing water-based, so better lifetime. Really not much of a preservative difference in terms of what's in those. It was more just showing a difference between maybe an optimal performance scenario versus a more typical. But then moving from the third one down, so the WBN is if you used a natural preservative, but you need to put, about an order of magnitude more. So we assume citric acid, which is used as preservative in some different industries, and rather than 0.1 or 0.2% of citric acid, you would actually need 1 or 2% for that to have the efficacy that's needed. The fourth scenario, the NP, is if there's no preservatives, so just removing all preservatives from the formulas, replacing it with water, and see what happens to the performance. NPR is no preservative, but you're refrigerating. So now there's no preservative, but you're refrigerating it every step of the way from, the raw materials, manufacturing, trucks, to the consumer, even having to, or stores and consumer having to refrigerate the product, and then sort of the energy needs there. Then SB is solvent-borne, so that's a legacy. We're not picking on solvent-based chemistries. There's plenty of cases where you may need solvents for a variety of performance means. This was more to show how far the industry has come based off of an older sort of model formula. The WB ion is an ionized, so actually kind of radiating the paint to try to kill stuff off, but you still don't have preservatives there in terms of the dry film. The pH scenario, as you can maybe guess, was sort of buffering the pH, so it was a very alkaline sort of, I forget if it was like 12 or 13 or somewhere between 11 and 12, I want to say, where you sort of buffer out the preservative, and which is something you see overseas for some products, although generally you can't tint those, and there's sort of other limitations. And that's what you are seeing right now is the limitations of some of these, where it could be cost or performance loss, whatever. WBS is, we've added some solvent. So it's, not quite a water reducible alkyd, but just, trying to make up, let's have some kind of naturally, I think the word is cidal properties, just because of what they are. So trying to take advantage of that. But of course, VOC then becomes an issue with those still. And then the last one was FD. That's if we use formaldehyde donors, which is, I think, something fairly common in the kind of personal care, cosmetic side of things. I don't actually know if these have really ever been used by the coatings industry, but what that could look like if we use that. Like, I think DM hydantoin is one. I'm not sure if I can't recall if that's what we use, but just fairly common commercial replacements for other formulated products. And then these are sort of what that meant in terms of the dry film lifetime, what spoilage rates would be. And this came from not just once again Sherwin-Williams. This is not our study. This is an industry thing. It was a cross-functional sort of group of suppliers and manufacturers and kind of users and whatnot. So this was numbers that we all sort of had and shared or sort of agreed on. And once again, we were not making any effort to stack the deck. It was to sort of put these things out there and and sort of welcome the feedback, whether it's from regulators, NGOs, or whatever. And so now the kind of key thing here, and I've just got a few minutes left, and then I'll open up to Q&A. So I know there's been a long runway to this, but once again, the first two scenarios are sort of our starting point. We have a sort of control and then a high quality, so kind of a doubled lifetime almost. And what you're looking at here, because this will look a little different than a lot of even LCAs, is we actually normalized everything against that first control. And so there are 5 indicators. Each indicator was normalized to that first control as a 1. And that's why you see, the thickness of those different indicators adds up to 5, and they're all identical because it's just 5 ones of bars of color. And what you see is, and once again, these are the indicators. I wouldn't treat them equally, but it was just a way of visually being able to showcase the results. Is that looking at what happens is you are generally seeing a doubling or worse of a lot of the indicators. And even if we look at just carbon footprint, so that's this global warming potential right here. So the darkest, the dark blue line your control, which is 1, this is probably around 0.5 or 0.4 on the high quality, you start getting into like 4 or so, 3 to 4 is fairly common. So you really are having a 3x, 4x difference in terms of your carbon footprint. And once again, this is just tinkering with a few thousand parts per million of a product. So, it really was, I don't think we expected results quite like this when we did it, but, as we sort of went through and we're kicking the tires on the calculations, it made sense because, you lose 10% right off the top because if you don't have preservatives, just for touch up, that's gone. Some of these, you've got real big energy burdens that are being put in there, or if like the solvent-based one, it's that you'll see the smog formation. This green, furthest outside one is very high. That's because you're looking at the highest VOC one, and sort of considerations like that. So, it is sort of a simplified way of doing it, but we felt like it was a more kind of straightforward way to communicate those sort of results. And so my last thing here, and then we'll have questions, is just one little shameless plug. So this is something we do on the hazard side for the Lead Green Building Program. It's called a product lens. And just what I want to call out about this is, this is an external toxicologist who reviews this. We don't influence this. We give an outside toxicologist our formulas, and then they do the assessment, and that's sort of the end of the transaction sort of thing, where it's not, we don't get to game this in any way, shape, or form. But what's kind of cool about this is rather than a straight hazard assessment, they look at the tox and hazard endpoints from a raw material, when it's a wet paint, when it's someone's painting, or I'm sorry, this is when they're painting, when it's a dried film on the wall, and then when you're end of life, however you're taking down the drywall or whatever. And then these letters, the INDs that are very small, it's there's an inhalation risk, TiO2 if it's a dust, dermal for I guess whatever a monomer was in this polymer. So what's kind of nice about this was we're starting to see some groups consider like TiO2. It has the CARC2 as a powder, from a classification standpoint, as a raw material. Once it's polymer, it's in a polymer matrix, it's encapsulated, whatever, the toxicologist sort of is like, oh yeah, no, that's not a problem anymore. So, I just, there are ways out there of sort of communicating some of the chemistry that happens, just looking at individual hazards of a precursor thing might not tell you what the overall hazard is of the final mixed good. But yeah, so just, when the takeaways from this is just, that holistic thinking, quantify benefits, consider trade-offs, and, just take the blinders off when you're sort of doing these sorts of things. So with that, yeah, just thank you for the opportunity to speak. Chris, do you want me to go to the slide you had given me before Q&A, or do you want to do that afterwards?
Why don't we do that after Q&A? So that's great. Well, again, thank you so much. That was a great presentation, and we so appreciate your tremendous insight, Doug. You're a wealth of knowledge. So at this time, we'd like to ask any of the attendees, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box at this time, and I will moderate them for Doug to answer. So we do have a few questions. Julie Vaughn was the first one. How are assumptions developed for the ratings of dry film life, spoilage rates, additional purchases for touch-up, et cetera, in the LCA?
No, a great question. And those came from, the industry. So it wasn't just like one company or, I don't know, like an academic sort of thing or guesses. Like it was, a number of stakeholders, whether it's our suppliers or other coating companies sitting down and saying, what are these numbers? Now, like the film weight, the 4 mils, that we kind of kept standard throughout. In fact, I think we told it even just removing the table. We didn't feel comfortable saying you could use way less coating for any of these or way more. So we tried to be sort of conservative with these. The touch-up one specifically came from the industry's product category rule. So when we actually publish what are called environmental product declarations, which there are, I believe, are hundreds now at this point for coating products. that you assume a 10% over purchase, and that was something that the industry had came up with that number, that about on average 10% of paint goes unused. So, one of the benefits of the preserved product is you could use that, whereas others, if there's no, it's just going to go bad within a matter of maybe days after you open it, rather than maybe years. So, but yeah, these are all coming from industry themselves, and we that's why we wanted to publish them. We didn't want folks to think we were just pulling arbitrary strings.
Mhm. Oh, very good, Doug. Thank you. Another question that Julie had is if we would like to compare LCA for additional scenarios side by side with those in the paper, what is the best way to proceed?
I would say, not to put Dave Drawling on the spot here, it looks like he may have dropped off already. I would say reach out to ACA with it, since they kind of lead the group. But if there's, we could certainly consider other scenarios. I think if you look at the first version in 2018 we published, I think we only had 4 or 5 scenarios, and there were some technology breakthroughs with stuff. There were some, products marketed as biocide free, and so we pulled data from some of those from challenge tests and whatnot. So that's, I want to be clear. One thing I probably should have said, if I didn't, was, I don't want folks to think I'm saying that, our preservation strategies are 100% perfect. Like, there's going to be changes, there could very well be optimizations, but, some of what's being proposed out there, which is sort of like, a all or nothing sort of thing, or really nothing, that's where, we're having concerns, because we don't have the widest palette we can pull from. There's specific bugs that go after paint that don't go after other products. We don't have as wide of a palette of things as maybe other industries do. So if we lose isobazolinones or omidines or whatever, we don't have that many more levers we can pull.
Okay, excellent. A question from Laura Kovac.
Mhm.
How is dry film lifetime determined or measured?
So that was also a function of the product category rule that the industry did. So that was actually a open stakeholder process that was back in, I think, 2015 through 2016. It was published. So the industry, some regulators, NGOs. Gosh, once again, Dave might remember more than I was involved with it, but we had written this rule set. So they're called a PCR, product category rule, that basically set thresholds around lifetime. And which test method. So like a high performance coating, which you saw the 15 years on there, was correlated to sort of this many scrubs with this burnish and washability for an interior. For exterior, I think it was some of the biological growth, erosion, flaking, and a few others. So it was an open stakeholder standard that a lot of us have been using for LCAs for about 5 or 6 years now. So we felt that to be consistent with what we've been publishing and putting out there, we should use with lifetimes. But to that point, I mean, there's absolutely products out there with lifetime warranties. And so, we were generally trying to be cautious, even when we developed that first standard. We don't want folks to think we're trying to stack the deck.
Very good. A question from Michael Augustine. What product sustainability metrics are relevant to you and why?
Oh gosh, I could spend an hour just on that. So, what I would say at a high level is, and for me, I'll answer that more of probably what I think would be helpful for folks on this call. It's, think about what your customers want, where your customers are located. If you're selling to DIY folks, you're going to get a very different answer. I'll say DIY in the Midwest versus DIY in California versus an IKEA in Europe or whatever. I mean, it's really what I would encourage, if you want to figure out, because there are hundreds of sustainability attributes, if you're saying, okay, I have scarce resources, I can't do everything for everyone, what should I do? Sherwin-Williams did a materiality assessment. You can find the whole write-ups on our website. That we did a survey and interviews. We actually brought in an outside firm to basically internally leadership, some more subject matter experts, customers, investors, academics. We even looked at competitors' documents and stuff, and sort of were able to plot out, the importance of the sustainability attributes to Sherwin-Williams internally, and the importance to our external stakeholders. And then, you know, you sort of look for things that are important to sort of both groups, and those become your tier one, we call them material issues. So for Sherwin-Williams, and this is publicly available, they are, I should know this, it's life cycle assessment, occupational health and safety, employee retention, employee attraction and retention, like carbon emissions, energy, water, kind of the resource side of things. And I am missing one, but there was 5 material issues we had, unless that happened to be 5. So yeah, I would encourage you to check out our website. But that's what I would say is I don't want to give you what I think it is, you know, personally or professionally, because depending on who you're talking to, it's going to be a different answer.
That is true. Okay, one more question, Doug. This one's from Suzette. Can you give an example of a WBHQ option?
High quality. So, you know, for Sherwin-Williams, we'll be talking like an emerald or like an emerald urethane. So for us, so I mean, you're talking premium sort of product. So, you know, I get in trouble for saying this. Maybe it's a, you know, for interior, it's an acrylic rather than a vinyl acrylic or something. Not that that's always be all end all, but it's something that, you know, has a very good scrubability, washability, and burnish. It just holds up. It's well-rounded. There's no sort of flaws and attributes like that. So it's, you know, we were careful not to say, oh, it just lasts 5,000 scrubs, it's high quality. We're looking for something that does well across the board.
Great. Well, that was many great questions. Thank you to the audience. And Doug, if you wouldn't mind turning to the next slide, thank you. Well, that is concluding our webinar for today. I really appreciate your attendance, and I hope you found that this was very informative and productive. Thank you to all our members and visitors for joining us today. And this presentation will be available to all CPCA CSCT members after this meeting. We will be posting this. On behalf of the CPCA, I would like to thank all of you for your interest, and I'd like to urge you all to reach out to us if you are either interested in joining our association or joining one of our committees. But just one more reminder, the CPCA is hosting our annual golf outing on July 22nd. We're excited to get out this year. If you'd like more information or wish to sign up, please contact Brenda. At this time, this is concluding our webinar, and we look forward to seeing you all next month. Goodbye.